Okay, so what are we talking about today? Yes. What was the question I left you with on Wednesday? Yes, go ahead.
How did industrialization impact, and then you do a green arrow?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. I'll do a blue if it's okay this time. How did it impact colonization? That is like a really critical question. And that's what we're going to answer today. But our example of this colonization isn't going to be just colonization generally. We're going to start with the Middle East. Now, we did this with China, and we're going to do it with the Middle East because you just can't not do it. In order to talk about the Middle East, I have to go back in time. So I'm going to start kind of from the beginning, very, very briefly, right up to 1500, and then up into our current era, which is what period? 1800 to right before World War I. If you read the material right before World War I think you should be able to handle this question. We'll see. If not, we'll just play it by ear. So I would put it up, let's just put 1915 here. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, just to keep in mind, to let you be alert, when we come back on Wednesday, I'm also going to answer this question, but I'm going to use a different example. What's the different example? India. Boom! Right on the ball. And in order to understand India, what also we have to do, we're going to have to do the same thing. A little bit up to around 1500, to about 1900. We're going to spend a lot more time, though, on 1800s, because that's when we see colonization really in action in India. Just like for the Middle East, even though I'm going to go do this background, just keep in mind that the real action that we're going to see also is going to be in the 1800s. Can anyone take a wild guess, even before I start these lectures, to tell me why the real action is 1800? I'll give you a hint. It has a lot to do with the question that I put up top.
Industrialization?
Yeah, and when does that really begin? 1790s, which is about 1800. And so that's really when we're going to see the lifeblood of this colonization. I'm just going to warn you now, there are two types of colonization. Exploration colonization, and then the second time is empire colonization. I'm pretty sure we already introduced this, so I'm just going to ask you, you know what the difference is between these two?
The exploration is where you're kind of going out and seeing what's out there. You might set up a colony and stuff,
Yeah.
but it doesn't necessarily benefit
Mother country.
Yeah, mother country, whereas empire, it's all about what the mother
Okay,
country
it's a very good explanation. I'm going to give you terms that will make it more clear. I think your explanation is really good. This is a term that's going to make it more clear. It's mercantilism. Prior to 1750s, there's not a lot of successful mercantilism. Mercantilism really begins in the late 1600s. I haven't explained it yet, I will. It begins in the late 1600s, but it's kind of being dabbled with. And it's being dabbled with by the Dutch, by the French, by the English, but it's dabbling. It's not until the mid to late 1700s that we see it really coming to fruition. And I'll tell you, it's largely because of this that the Americans have their revolution, because the colonies are going to be treated differently. I'll give you one other hint here, just to kind of get your background. During this part of colonization, this was pre-mercantilism, and this is more of a legacy of feudalism. We talked about this before. During this era, at the very beginning, wealth was really equated with how much land you had, which is why Spain went off and took huge parcels of land. Now, in hindsight, we haven't spoken about this directly, but I think you get this. Does Spain benefit from these huge parcels of land? Temporarily, but no, they don't. What happened eventually, especially long term, what happened to all of them? They're gone. Okay? So this was not enduring, it wasn't successful. What happens in this era, wealth is not based off of land. What's it based off of? Trade, profit, right? Which is not unusual for us today. If I'm working at a bakery and they're not making a profit, how long am I going to be working there? Super easy. Not long, right? They have to be making a profit in order to be paying me. That's wealth. If it's not working. Now, in the Middle Ages, if I'm working for a bakery, how long do I work there? I'm working there, right? It's kind of it's not a duty, but often the bakery is probably owned by the local lord, and so you're giving a portion to the lord that allows you to be there. It's kind of like your rent. You may not see much money. It's different. Okay. Let's go ahead and do our daily quiz. I'm just going to give you a hint on the daily quiz. It has to do with geography. If you don't understand geography, especially world history, it's tough. But in this particular section, it's really important to understand what we're talking about. So I'm just going to give you a question, and while you do that, I'm just going to randomly doodle on the board. I do this map quite often, actually. How about this? I'm going to skip forward. It's cheating. Okay? I'm going to go into the 1900s, 20th century. I'm going to tell you about the fact that there were two guys here, Germany and Austria, right? And then there were some guys over here, France, England, and Belgium, okay, and Russia. Okay? And I'll say down here, there's another guy. There's a reason why I'm using these colors. But are they completely removed from Europe? No, they are involved with World War I. So of all these guys, who is most influenced by Western political traditions? Now, this does not mean that they would be considered the West. Today, the Ottomans don't have that name. What's the name of the old Ottoman Empire today?
Germany and the Turks.
Turkey. Okay, Turkey today. And is Turkey European?
No, it's the Middle East.
It's a really tough question. I don't know if you know much about modern Turkey. It's not European. It's not Middle Eastern. It is genuinely a combination of the two. You could say it'd be Europeanized. If you go to a Turkish city, a big Turkish city, it looks very European. You go outside of that city, it does not look European. Okay, you go off to Baghdad, it does not look European. Flat out, not going to be, right? But Turkey, it does. It's got a very strong European influence. Now you guys, the other question is, how do we see that influence? Rather than trying to look at the cause, we're looking at a symptom. How do we see that influence in modern Turkey that we don't see? Let me just make sure that you understand locations here. So Safavids, the Eastern Khanates. Why is Khan a familiar name to you guys? The Great Khan, right?
Chinese.
Genghis Khan, exactly, Chinese. Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. The Khans, when the Mongols took over China, then their leaders were little Khans. Genghis Khan, Great Khan, Little Khan, okay? So the Eastern Khanates, where would that be? In the East, okay. Today, actually, their modern names would be like Uzbekistan. The northern realms up here, I'm going to use a different color here, around these guys, okay? Eastern Khanates. What about Mughals? India, that's exactly right. Okay, if you think of the, what is the pretty building? Taj Mahal, that would be a Mughal architecture, okay? What about the Safavid? And this is where my map is sorely tested, because it's not really even there very well. It has to be stretched about that far, and then you'll see it. It's going to be what would be called modern-day Iran and Iraq. And where are the Ottomans? The Ottomans stretch over. Now, I'm going to tell you now where the Ottomans are in in theory, is not the same as where the Ottomans are in reality. That makes sense? And we'll explain why this is. What about over here, at one point before 1500, who had this area? You don't have to give a specific Muslim. Who? The Muslims. And then who kicked them out in the late 1480s, right? It's called the Conquista. From 1400 basically up into 1460, they're slowly pushing out the Muslims. And what does that become? That becomes Spain. That's why Spain is different than the rest of Europe. Jews, in order to understand the Middle East, you must understand Islam. Okay, that makes sense? Okay, and I don't know how many of you actually understand Islam, like what its theories are. It's easy. I think in this class we've already talked about what the basic premise of Judaism is and the basic premise of Christianity, just like we found out what the basic premise of, well, we haven't really talked about Hinduism yet. We will on our Wednesday, but certainly we talked about Buddhism, right? And we talked about Taoism back when it was a religion, but you remember it didn't stay a religion all that time. And we talked about Confucianism, which was never a religion. It was always a philosophy, ethics, okay? And we can see Taoism kind of be in the middle because it kind of was in the middle for a while. Okay, well, we'll put that aside. So in order to understand China and Japan, you have to understand their religious views. In order to understand the Middle East, you must understand Islam. Okay, that makes sense? But I'm just going to put this up there, and I'm going to go back to this other discussion that we had last class. And I want to make sure that you get this. I talked a lot about what produced industrialization, and I kept talking about this being intellectual history. Today, not so much intellectual history, but can someone tell me some of the seeds that led to industrialization? Just throw them out there. Good.
Scientific method.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Scientific revolution. This is critical. And if you remember, the scientific revolution is pretty early. We're looking at like late 1400s, the end of the Renaissance, all the way to the kind of late 1600s. What else? There's another big one that we talked about. Go ahead. You what? Okay, you're right. I didn't spend a lot of time talking, but I did. I was talking about the agricultural revolution and how that increased the population. So it's true, the demographic change. I would say ag-rev, which is leading to this demographic change. Okay, and we'll explain why that's a big deal. There's a last concept that I spent a lot of time talking about. Enlightenment. Okay. And what was the Enlightenment?
Movement that applied scientific methodology to social problems.
Boom, absolutely right. Okay, so exactly. So the beauty of this, and I hope you got this. So if not, I'm going to make it really explicit now. Does industrialization just happen? No, it does not. It has a very long precursor. We're going to put industrialization, we're going to put date ranges here. I'm going to say 1780s, even though it's really 1790 that we really begin to see this. And I'm going to push it all the way up, industrialization, up until around 1900. It's not an overnight phenomenon, but more importantly than this, it does not begin in 1780. It doesn't begin in 1790. This is a movement that goes way back, and I would argue, into the European Middle Ages. And this was a point that I was trying to make, and I don't know if you may connect the dots. Why did I talk about monotheism and scientific revolution? Anybody remember this? Go ahead.
Because monotheism made it the earth under one God, and so there would be one creation.
One nature to study. Yes. Why did I talk about that? You're absolutely right. Why did I talk about that?
Because if there's more than one, they always see another God.
Okay, you're very close. Why is that important? I actually used it as a segue from a previous discussion. What was the previous discussion? Why didn't Asia have a scientific revolution? Is that what the question was? That's exactly what the question was. Amazingly right. And why not? They didn't have one single nature. They just flat didn't have it. Remember, we talked about there being kind of a lot of pseudoscience in alchemy. Alchemy went from Asia through the Middle East into Europe. When it hit Europe, boom, it becomes a scientific revolution. It's not a scientific revolution in Asia. In Asia, what is alchemy? I mentioned this. I don't know if you guys caught why I was talking about it. How many spirits, according to the Taoists, do I have in my body? Like 36,000, right? Because everything is done by some spirit. So what are you doing in alchemy? You're trying to understand the unseen world. Today, Taoism is still kind of mystical. It's no longer a religion. Feng Shui, have you ever heard of Feng Shui? Totally Taoist. You ever heard of yoga? Do you know why you get into those positions?
You're trying to flush out your spirits or something?
Yes!
Oh.
Your chi, right, is in your body, but it likes to pool up in certain places. And so you are doing the gymnastics in order to push it in all the areas of your body. It's a Taoist idea. Feng Shui is that the spirits are kind of in your household and you're trying to push these things in order to make it work. This is not scientific. It's like almost the exact opposite of scientific. Scientific is observational for the most part. We're looking at inductive reasoning. There's no observation here.
It's more placebo.
And part of it is not placebo. It's more of an intuition. It's certainly deductive reasoning. It's intuition of things that you cannot see. The point here is that the reason why they don't have a scientific revolution in the East is because there's no monotheism. Once it gets to the West, all this alchemy, boom, scientific revolution. Huge. Francis Bacon, I talked about, you guys know about Francis Bacon. He's the one that comes up with the scientific method. He loved alchemy. His first book was really talking about alchemy. Today, we look at alchemy as the predecessor to chemistry. So all your chemists love alchemy because it's like you're trying to change lead into gold, right? How do we do that today? Well, we can't. But when we're trying to make things, potions, boiling, all that melting, that's all chemistry. It comes out of alchemy. The point here, is it an accident that industrialization starts in Europe? No. It's not an accident that it starts in Europe. Is it an accident that within Europe it starts in England? The reason why I make this comment is that you guys have a bunch of textbooks that are talking about this. And according to your textbooks, who was more successful around 1700? And I shouldn't say your textbooks, some of your very, very recent textbooks. Who's more successful around 1700? Asia or the West? Asia. According to your textbooks, they are looking at industrialization as if it were an accidental product of 1800. They got industrialization, boom, they just pushed right forward. To me, it's almost historical malpractice because it assumes that it just pops up. Does anything, you've studied lots of history, does anything just like pop up? There's a predecessor, something that comes before it. And for industrialization, all of this comes before it. Deep into the Middle Ages. And I would argue even before that, you're looking at trends of humanism that was set by the Greeks and the Romans. Just like Taoism is a trend that was set by the early Han Dynasty in China. It's a long prelude. It wasn't an accident that it was Europe that went to discover China and Japan. It's kind of a byproduct of that scientific revolution, that scientific discovery. So having said that, it's very important to understand that industrialization is really unique to Europe. And so this helps us to understand when we talk about Europe and we talk about the places where it goes. It's not just that these guys are greedy and bigoted and racist or sexist or whatever else you want to throw on them. They are different in their worldview. We saw that with China, obviously, and Japan. We're going to see that in India and absolutely we're going to see that in the Middle East. Now here's a funny thing. So all of these guys kind of are toward the east. But if I look at all three of these, is there a further major division between these three guys? Two on one side, one on the other. What is that major division? You're right.
India, China, Japan, all kind of had the same religious. Middle East is.
That's exactly right. It's the Middle East. Today, there's a big difference. Now, what's the difference? Okay, now, industrialization is a shift from human labor to mechanical labor resulting in mass production. The very first use of industrialization is in textiles. Very shortly after that, we're going to see it in mining, and there's kind of a combination of both of these guys. Inventions are never completely isolated, but with that, of course, we're going to eventually get railroads. Before we get railroads, we're going to get canals, but they start with textiles. The bottom line is factories. That's what defines industrialization. Factories. The first factories happened in 1790s in England. Okay, and what they did is they used water wheel technology. When we say a water-powered, this does not mean that they have this great big tub of water and it pushes the water with pneumatics. It's kind of cool, but no, that's not what it means. Water power means that you have a water wheel. We have a water power, had one right here in Richmond Center. That mill pond was from the mill, so the water wheel is on the river, right? And so the river is very powerful, pushing that wheel. And so that means you put a lot of pressure on that wheel. And I don't know how many of you guys deal with engines or whatnot, but this wheel just has a camshaft. What does a camshaft do? That's pretty important.
It changes circular motion into
That's exactly what it does. So this is going in a circle, and so you have some long rod or something here, and every time before that knob is there, when you're on the smooth part, it's down. Every time the knob pops up, you suddenly moved it upwards, right? Boom, boom, boom. So this circular motion is now up and down motion. Well, depending on where you put your rod, you can have up and down, you can have side to side, so that means that you can have saws, right? You can have bellows, you can have great big weights of stamping, pressing. If on the very end of this, you've got a bunch of gears set up, boom, 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 and boom, 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 then you can have twisting motion there. What is, when I say mill pond, what is that most often used for? Grain mill. Yeah, grain mill. Okay, two great big giant millstones. Now the funny thing is that this mill pond wasn't a grain mill. What was this mill? Saw. So it was a blade, and so they just hooked it up. It was based off the water wheel, so lots of belts and everything like this. This is a simplified version. This is European 1100s. So a water power. At the beginning, it's doing things like mills and saws and whatnot. But then it gets bigger, and somebody creates a water-powered spinner. You guys have heard every fairy tale there is, from Hans Christian Andersen and whatnot. What does the pretty girl always learn how to do? She's always spinning, right? And if she's amazing, she can spin straw into gold, right? I mean, you want to marry her instantly, because she can spin like every day. Well, the truth of the matter is, you look at this metaphorically, of course, is that how do you get your cloth? How do you get your thread? It's called cottage industry. Cottage industry. We use this word today to mean something like a very small, local, handmade type of industry. Technically, cottage industry, things that are built in the cottage. And it is the characteristics handmade, and I think we would use this today, and one at a time, right? Not mass produced. Handmade, one at a time. All of your cloth prior to 1700s was handmade, one at a time. You're sitting around the hearth, the guy's been doing whatever, and the women folk are spinning. Spin, spin, spin. Once they've got their cloth, their thread, what do? They take the thread and then they do the loom. Well, we invent a spinner so you can just dump the wool into one end, and then it turns into thread on the other end. Well, if you can invent this in 1788, what must you invent in 1790? The water-powered loom. And they do, 2 years later, same guy. So what you've got is a factory where you dump wool in on one end and it comes out cloth on the other. This didn't come out because Hargreaves just said, hey, I have a brilliant idea. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? And just to let you know, if we look at Europe, and I'll do this one more time, here's England, Ireland, here's France, other people, okay. Belgium is that little spot up here. We didn't used to call it Belgium, we called it Flanders. And at one point, there's a strong connection. They just have sheep up the gazoo, wool from Flanders. So much of this. England had certainly a renewed relationship with Flanders, and so you've got a ton of wool coming into England. Well, how does that wool get processed? It's got to be processed by hand. Now, it's a cottage industry, so the wool comes to the dock, you go down to the dock, you get a bunch of wool, you bring it back in, and you spin. And if you're really good at it, what can you do? Well, you can sell the thread to other people that specialize in the looms. Now, really, this is all happening while it's also local. You have your own sheep in the backyard. You have your own looms, your own spinners, right? The point is you can create a marketplace. I'm mentioning this because one of the things that your textbooks don't emphasize enough is that cottage industry is what rules the world. We talk about China. And when we talked about China, we were talking about some of Chinese beautiful artworks, particularly their ceramics. You know, when you pull out your fine ceramic dishes, what do we call it? China. That's because they became known for that. Not factories. All of those pieces, one at a time. It doesn't mean that you don't have some very skilled houses where people are making these all the time. They're all one at a time, by hand. They can still be kind of like a business where they're making them, but it's all one at a time. What we get when we have the textiles is that it's mass-produced, resulting in mass production. The machine is doing it, not the people. Now I'm going to take one step further. Why do we include Enlightenment when we talk about industrialization? Why didn't Rome have industrialization, even though they had some amazing technology? Slave labor. Slave labor. So as people become more aware of their individual rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, as people begin to live more in urban settings, which means you have more money, this is going to help to promote the industrialization. If you're getting paid, what do we do with that money? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Remember, John Locke didn't use the word pursuit of happiness. He used the word the right to private property. You have free money. What do you get to do? Whatever you want to do. That's the whole concept then of liberty. Do you think industrialization quashes the Enlightenment or accelerates the Enlightenment? Accelerates. Okay. How does this deal with the Middle East? Well, that's a great question. Let me give you second definition. Number one was industrialization. I hope you got that. Number two is mercantilism. We talked about this at the very beginning. This is the difference between the old colonization that was really based off of exploration. You get a bunch of land as well. And the new colonization, which is you're trying to turn a profit, trade. Mercantilism is an economic policy that strives to bring more gold into the country than goes out. This is a very technical dictionary type of definition because we don't want to have kind of like a circular definition. We could use this definition, we could use a single word. Anybody know what single word would come back to here?
Profit.
It's profit. Yeah, that's it. More gold coming in than going out. It's silly, right? Of course, that's what a profit is. But we are in an industrialized society. Of course, we understand profit. But in feudalism, feudalism was based off a personal relationship between the lord and the vassal. There's no profit involved. It's a duty, a sense of duty. I am bound to you. I am your peasant. You give me the lands, I work it, right? I give you a portion of it, but I get to be working it. And if somebody comes over the fence, you protect me. It's personal relationships. It's not money. During most of the Middle Ages, there's no money involved. And remember, Columbus is 1492. He's still in feudalism, especially Spain, right? They're still thinking in terms of feudalism. They go out and explore. What gives you more wealth? More land to give out, because that gives you more plantations. That gives you more people. So you have more vassals. Wealth is land. Does not work for Spain, because that's not what the modern era is about. It doesn't matter how much land you have. How much profit can you come from it? Mercantilism is a completely new, this is really important, it's a new way of looking at things. Even in the 1600s, remember the Virginia colony had to get a charter from the king before they could start. The king was in control of everything. That's an old-fashioned style. Mercantilism eventually is going to promote individual liberty. How is that? From this concept called the free market. Adam Smith is from which country? Are we shocked? Where is the Enlightenment starting from? From England. All these concepts of the Enlightenment, of new technologies, of new discoveries, they're all tied together. And so the new market is also tied together. Individuals, we believe they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or your ability to have private property. The point is liberty. And this helps to push mercantilism. I said the United States break away because of mercantilism. Well, in a grand scheme of empires, what that means is that when we look at England, France tried to do this, the Dutch did this, Spain, I don't think ever tried. That's why they failed. So England, France is actually physically way bigger than England, and then the Netherlands, okay? What you do is you have colonies. England has colonies because everybody else had colonies. In the beginning, it was Spain, and Spain had huge colonies. But remember, Spain had feudal colonies. So they went over there and they sent people like you would send vassals. Didn't work so much. When England started this, they also kind of did that. The United States, you know, you have just a few little outposts. But England was slow on this. The French and the Netherlands actually were pretty quick. They didn't send out colonies. They send out people. What does France mostly get out of the New World?
Oh, Canada.
Furs.
Oh, yeah.
It will eventually lead to Canada. But mainly fur traders, individuals, going among the natives. When you're looking at, I would say probably 1650, 1700, you're dealing with literally a couple of hundred French in Canada. A couple of hundred. By 1700, there's probably 20 times more British in the American colonies than there are French. They have a huge area, but nobody's there. There's just no French, because it's mostly individuals. Now there's the other funny thing. Because they're mostly individuals, how much money does France get from this? These individuals are wealthy, right? Cartier, right? It's French, right? Very wealthy. But France does not get its wealth from them. They get their wealth from the people that are in France. Okay, what about Netherlands? They do the same thing, but they don't actually go out and do furs. they're focusing on spices, they're focusing on materials. And they also, at home, have a bunch of banks that are helping to finance all these expeditions. So some of the Netherlands folks were the ones that were financing Virginia colonies. They were financing the Pilgrims, right? Where did the Pilgrims come from right before England? From the Netherlands. So these guys have banks, they're financing, they are starting the idea of mercantilism. After about 100 years, England shifts from James I, and we end up with the Glorious Revolution and this concept of individual liberties. So by 1700, their economic policies also change. And so these colonies that are all around the world aren't just outposts for land, they become trading posts. And the goal of mercantilism is that you go and get the raw materials from the colony, you send those back home. The home finish these products, and then you sell the products both to other neighbors like France and the Netherlands and back to your colony. If you can sell the finished product to the same person that you bought the raw material from, what do you get? It's a profit. That's mercantilism. Why does this cause the American Revolution? Because we're one of these colonies. And so England said, you guys remember this vaguely from American history, you cannot trade with anybody else because if our raw materials are going to France or Netherlands or Spain or anybody else, England loses. So the Navigation Acts in England saying you cannot trade with anybody else. The big French and Indian War wasn't because we didn't like France so much, it's that wiped them completely off North America because then the American colonies will only trade with who? England. That was the reason. By the end of the 1700s, England got mercantilism better than anyone else. It caused them to lose the American colonies. But as soon as the American colonies are lost, how do they start treating their other colonies, like Canada? Much differently. It really begins to say you can have local government. You can have local government. But we want the trade. It's about the trade. Because mercantilism. Now just pause for a second. How does industrialization help to contribute to colonization? Go ahead.
We talked about this in economics.
Very good. What's the answer? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, because industrialization, you can finish a lot more raw materials, so you can support, or you need a lot more colonies buying it.
Yes. Now, this is very, very important to understand because sometimes students don't get this. So I'm just going to be very explicit. Where does industrialization begin? It begins in Europe, mostly in England. It does spread out to France and other places, but it's slow. And it's going from the west to the east. Remember, when I first started off this unit, I made the point there's a difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. What's the difference? And I kind of hinted and hummed and hawed. I don't know that I was very clear, but I said two big things. Number one was constitutionalism, and number two, industrialization. We hadn't quite defined it, so I didn't really put that in there. But these are the big things, and they go hand in hand. As constitutionalism spreads, so too does industrialization. But let me even be more clear. As industrialization spreads, so too does the demand for constitutionalism. So here we have this shift. Well, we see this in Europe. Take a wild guess about the rest of the world, knowing what you know about cultural diffusion. You get this? Okay, now. Industrialization is European, industrialization is English. How many American factories do we have before the revolution? How many Indian factories do we have? Knowing what you know about mercantilism, how does this have to work? Where must the factories remain? In England. They must be in England, right? Because you get the raw materials for nothing in the colony. What if there's a whole bunch of factories in that colony? Why would they give you the raw material? They need it, right? So you have no incentive to build the factory there. You build the factory back home. Now, this sounds harsh and cold, but you have to understand how much planning is involved. You did the colony to get the raw materials. You're not saying, we're not going to do any factories there because we hate you. The factories are already at England. We're just not going to spend the money to export our factories to India. It's so much cheaper just continuing to gather the raw materials. But if you don't have factories there, what doesn't also get exported? Yet, the constitutionalism. But I say yet because the United States is a perfect example. That intellectual cultural effusion was just part and parcel. But of course, the United States is so unique. I mentioned this before. Why is the United States unique from basically all the other colonies? Who makes up most of the United States citizens? By a vast majority. English. And so it's not really taking over. In India, mostly it's Indians. Right? In the United States, mostly they're English. Speak English. Read English. Participate in all these big problems. The Puritans, right? They're the ones that were backing the Cromwell Revolution. We were tied with England. It wasn't really, at the very beginning, England had the colonies in the Americas only because they were afraid of losing everything, because the French were up to the north, the Spanish were to the south. They didn't have any designs on it, they just put some people there. By the end of the century or more, they're trying to plan out mercantilism. But this is late, and the United States is a completely different scenario. Now, as we mentioned, the United States has this big revolution. Are they going to do the same things in India as they did in the United States? No. Local government. Indians ruling mostly other Indians. The English, their job, simply to rule the ports. And we'll talk about this process in a second, particularly when we go into India. Okay, 15 minutes. Let's shift over and understand real briefly about Islam and the Middle East. I'm going to spend all of about 28 seconds. 28 seconds giving you background on the Middle East. Where does the Middle East come from? One. Here's the Middle East, right? Let me give you my Middle East here. This clearly is first civilization, right? Mesopotamia. Okay, and Egypt second. And then after Egypt, Mesopotamia had a whole bunch of empires, including the Persian Empire. There's contact between Mesopotamia and Greece, Persian Wars. And then this guy named Alexander does what? Conquers Persia and Egypt. So that becomes the first big unification. And then what happens, I don't know, maybe 150 years later? Rome rises up and takes over most of this area. The thing is that Rome never goes past, really, this line. Alexander the Great went from Greece, Persia, and he went all the way out to this river. He didn't go to the second river. He went to the first river. By that time, I don't know if you know, we talked about this a lot in ancient Syria. Alexander the Great's success is he's got lots of cool technology, but most of his success is that he's winning and everybody knows that he's winning, and so you almost give up before you start. By the time he goes into Egypt, they literally gave up without a fight. Thank you for coming to release us from those naughty Persians. They come back, he matches the Persians, they start this battle, and then boom, all the Persians start running away. It's the reputation that was powerful. What reputation does he have off in India? None. You've got to fight, right? And they're fighting differently. Alexander doesn't know how to do this. So they get to this edge. His people are not, they're winning. They are winning. It gets out, they are winning, but not like they used to. They're getting depressed. They think that the world's going to end anytime, so he turns around, comes back, have his men starve on the way back. But nevertheless, huge out here. So we have a lot of influence way off, even to the edge of India. But then what happens? Alexander dies. I mean, within 5 years, he's dead. And his empire divides into 4 main sections. You've got the Greeks, you've got the Egyptians, you've got the Persians, and then you've got this area. And the guys who own this part sold off this area literally for a handful of elephants. They wanted the elephants, but it wasn't the elephants. Why did they get rid of it? This is a really easy answer.
Couldn't hold on to it.
Yeah, Get rid of it, give it legally, and then you don't have to worry about it, right? And you save face. You don't have them taking it from you for nothing. So get the handful of elephants and then go. This is kind of the beginning, and it's this region right here, okay? That's kind of the beginning of Iran, Iraq, and very strong influence from the Greeks. Well, okay, time passes. Time passes, and as you remember, the Silk Road went right through this area during the Roman Empire. But it was also really a pass-through. So during most of the Roman Empire, India was benefiting from this trail that goes through. But you remember, this isn't a trail like an actual road with pavement. It's simply trade. And people are trading from one side of the street basically to the other. So you've got hundreds and hundreds. Nobody is physically walking from one end to the end to the other. You don't get that till Marco Polo. That's around 1200 Marco Polo. But it is still a pipeline of goods. And while Rome is big, India's got some power into it. Also, this Middle East area has some. When Rome collapses, India collapses. And so too does this area in the Middle East. You don't really get solidification until around 650 AD. That's about, what, 150 years after Rome collapsed in the West. At least 450 years after the Pax Romana. Okay? What is happening to 650? Anybody remember? I may have mentioned it, I don't know. Let's talk about this real quick. Okay, so first of all, you have to realize that when we think about Saudi Arabia is mostly a desert. And so what that means is that Saudi Arabia has never been part of the Persian Empire or the Assyrian Empire or the Egyptian Empire or the Greek Empire. It's a desert, flat a desert. Okay? When Rome had its territories, basically through Judea, there's a bunch of mountains over here. They're on this side. The Parthians are over here. They're kind of the successors to the Persians. But they are north. This is desert. Thing is around 1200 BC, we domesticate the camel. Did not have that domestication before. And so instead of doing the trip that most people did for the Fertile Crescent, which was to go up and then around, you could go from here to there, not over the water, but through the desert with a camel. This creates certain trade routes through Saudi Arabia, beginning slowly. By the end of the Persian Empire, you had a couple of trade routes around here. My math is terrible, but you get the point. On the outskirts. That's about 550s BC. By the time you get to Rome and after, you have a few more. One of these little spots, and what you have is by doing trade routes, you get oases. And you guys know what an oasis is, right? It's a water hole, okay, out in the middle of the desert. You don't know where the water hole is until you stumble across it. But once you stumble across it, you know where it is forever. And the people that actually do the trading basically go from one water hole to the next. You do not have a kingdom out here, but you do begin to have people whose jobs are trading. And the big water holes may have lots of folks nearby. Any of you guys ever see the movie Lawrence of Arabia?
I've seen a lot of movies.
Lawrence of Arabia is a great movie to really emphasize this point. Lawrence of Arabia is about World War I. So it's after this fact. But even by World War I, the Middle East is still organized in very much the same way. So you have trading areas. This is ruled not by states, because you don't have any states. It's really ruled by tribal laws. In some way, you might even call it feudal, except it's not. Feudalism is based off the memory of one big state, and then it kind of breaks down. Tribal laws never had a state here yet. It's really just groups, tribals, families. And the problem with tribal law is that because there's no police, and we saw this in feudalism, How do you settle differences? You fight, right? You strike my face. If you kill me, my brothers are going to kill 2 of you. It's deterrence. Don't wound me at all. You slap my face, we'll kill you in response. You remember that whole concept, eye for an eye? This is not a command. Anybody understand eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? It's a limit. This is a problem that goes way back. Hammurabi, 1800 BC. It's a limit. They take the eye out. You do not get the chance to kill that person. It's not equal. Eye for an eye. That's it. No more. Tooth. You lost a tooth. Just a tooth. Nothing more. You can't kill the person. The point is that tribal law is moving towards acceleration. You guys understand Hatfield and McCoys and the feuds? That's what this is. I mention that because there's no state here. When Muhammad comes, he gets these recitations from the angel Gabriel. What's most important of anything is that Muslim means one who submits. Submits to who?
Oh, no, monotheism.
God. Absolutely. To God. And if you look at this from a political perspective, if God's law is above all other laws, what does that do to the tribal laws? You quash it. Muhammad was very successful. He was at that point, right? Now, you can look at it theologically if you wish, but let's not. Let's just talk about it politically. What this means here is you've got, after however many years of trading back and forth, you begin to have people right at that breaking point where you have a concentration of population big enough to begin a complex government. Who's going to be able to start this complex government? Whoever can stop the conflict. Why do Muslims go off to Mecca once in their life, a pilgrimage? What's big about Mecca? Well, Mecca had, it was kind of a trading spot, water hole. It's important for lots of people. There were lots of Jews there. There were some Christians there. I shouldn't say lots. There were some. Okay? Mostly, they were pagans that believed in lots of gods. Some of them, Zoroastrians, who just believed in 2 gods. There was also this big black asteroid, basically. And that's where Mecca, that's what the bill is. This is big black rock. And if it's in the middle of a desert, it's weird, right? So that's why it became a natural focal point for people. Well, Muhammad is from there. Now, there's another place called Medina. And what's famous about Medina is that Muhammad leaves from Mecca, goes out to Medina, and there's 5 different groups around there. They're all fighting. Some of them Jews, some of them Christian, lots of them pagans. He comes in, and as he is able to restore order among all of these 5 warring, battling groups. Think of it as the Hatfield versus McCoys versus the Joneses, Smiths, whatever. He fixes it. And this becomes like the start. He can then come back to Mecca. And he is a unifying force. In our mind, say, for example, Judeo-Christianity, in Christianity, the church is separate from the state. I think I mentioned this back in the Gospels when they're trying to trip Jesus, and they asked, should we pay taxes? And Jesus says, pull up one of the tax coins, whose face is on that? It's Caesar's. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God. Right in the beginning, separation. My kingdom is not of this world. So we don't have popes running out there with battle gear, fighting, leading the charge. We don't have monks or priests doing that either. The church is always separate. They're not pacifists, but they're not part of that battle. In Islam, Muhammad is the general. They don't have that division. One who submits. There's lots of theological reasons. I'm not going to talk about it so much, except to say that what Islam does, more than anything, is unites the whole region. And it spreads like wildfire. It happens to coincide right at the time when Rome completely is collapsed. 150 years collapsed out of Western Europe. And in the eastern half is also getting weak. And so you have a power vacuum. Muhammad is able to come in, and then boom, he just sweeps across. By the time the 700 comes around, within about 50 years, Muslims have most of Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Arabia, into Persia, and pushing back into India. unites them. Muhammad's not God. So what happens to Muhammad? He dies. Okay? Muhammad unites by pushing God's law over the tribal law. Does he eliminate those tribal divisions? No. Immediately. I mean, immediately. We have our first division between the Shia and the Sunni. Muhammad dies, right? Who takes over? Well, according to classical tribal law, wouldn't his son take over? But according to his new idea about God's law triumphing another, what about his lieutenant? The guy who's second in command? Immediately there's a conflict. And this isn't just limited to that point. This conflict among many of the Muslims goes on for centuries. Eventually, you have kind of a division. Spain is under one group. Egypt is kind of under another group. Arabia is under another group. This part in Persia and Arabia, they kind of combine. This area, which would be the Ottomans, this is the Byzantine, but eventually the Byzantines are going to fall out, also a different group. The Muslims are united by Islam, but they are not united politically. Never once is there a single Islamic state. It's always divided by different factions and groups. Some of them theological, many of them tribal, political. These are the divisions. So we go back. What's the difference between Turkey today and Iran today? Well, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we come back on Wednesday, but somebody take a hint. It has to do with these divisions between those that are going to be faith by heritage or faith by practice. I don't need to spend a lot of detail on this. I'll just say this. You guys know people who call themselves Christian. Do they ever go to church? You have people that call themselves Christian that go to church every week. You don't know this probably as familiar. I'm very familiar with this. You have people that are Jewish. They eat pork, ham and cheese sandwiches. You have people that are Jewish that do not have their kippah. They have the beard. They follow all the rules. And yet they still call themselves Jewish. What's the difference? Hasidic, Orthodox, Reform, different factions in this, right? Same thing in Islam. So if you are faith by your heritage, is this the same as faith by your practice?
No.
Do you think this might cause divisions? Yes, we'll talk about that. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? We will see you guys on Wednesday.